It's a real treat to present with you today, and I want to start off by thanking my good friend Lori Ashton, who put me in touch with Sandy to set this up. So I want to start our tale by going to the airport, a place that many of us have not visited for a while, but are looking forward to visiting. Um, and I want to start with a story, and really it's a saga. And as with all great sagas, it has a hero and it is a villain. And we're not going to tell you which is which. So I want you to meet James Beach. He's a big guy. He's over 6 feet tall. He travels a lot. He's on a crowded United flight from Newark to Denver. He's sitting in the middle seat in row 12. After takeoff, he lowers his tray table, takes out his laptop. But before he starts to work, he also takes out these two plastic clamps called knee defenders. And he puts them on the front of the tray table. You can see them circled here in the photo. They cost about 21 bucks on the internet. They lock the front seat in place. As the ad says, it will stop reclining seats on an airplane, so your knees won't have to. It's the real deal. He opens his laptop, starts typing. The passenger in front can't recline her seat. She realizes what the problem is eventually. She asks Beats to remove them. Whether he did or not is unclear. In any case, he didn't remove them quickly enough. And so she slams her seat back. The knee defenders pop out. The laptop is jolted into his chest. He jams the seat back up. He reattaches the clamps. She then turns around and throws her cup of water into his face. We don't actually know how this might have escalated because the pilot at that moment changed course to Chicago. For an emergency landing, passengers are moved from the plane, abashed, one hopes. It continues on to Denver, an hour and 38 minutes late. Similar event happens a week later, Boston to Paris flight. And these high altitude brawls quickly went viral. The blogosphere is booming with self-righteous claims. Now, fights over reclining seats may seem foolish and frankly, maybe even a little stupid, but they reveal a great deal about how the hidden rules of ownership work. And so in the first half of the talk, we're going to ask 3 questions to frame this issue. Why is reclining an ownership conflict at all? Why are these battles breaking out now? And who's the villain, who's the hero? The first question I asked. So let's start with the first question. Why is reclining an ownership issue? I mean, it might seem pretty straightforward. Where does ownership come in? And the answer is the real conflict is over the control of the wedge of space behind the seat. It's shown in yellow, the yellow triangle here. Who owns, who controls the wedge? The recliner in front or the knee defender in the back? Now realize, of course, that ownership conflicts occur in all other parts of flying, right? What about the shared armrest, the unspoken jostling? Here you've got one way to address that through a clever entrepreneur. But it's not just that. It's the space in the luggage rack above, luggage space above. It's where the window shade goes up or down. Every inch on board, at least in economy, can be contested, and even more so today with concerns over social distancing. And this is true not just on airplanes. Ownership invisibly shapes every day of our lives, every minute. These are the rules that decide who gets what and why. Whether you stand at the front of the line or the back, it's where you live, it's what medications you take, it's where you drive. Hundreds of times a day, we encounter decisions over who gets what, and these are all decided by a small handful of ownership rules. And much of this operates completely outside the law. As we tell our law students and sort of try to beat into them, law is overrated. It's highly overrated. This is true all over the world. It always has been, it always will be. And realize, of course, our drive to own is hardwired. It goes way back in evolutionary history, and not just for humans, right? All species compete for the control of scarce, valuable resources. So it's springtime now, the birds are singing, it's pleasant, bucolic, we walk outside, what wonderful chirping. I suspect you might think differently if you heard what the birds actually are saying. Because the fact is, oftentimes birdsong marks territory, and they're saying, back off, don't even think about coming here. This space is mine. And we humans really are no different. You spend some time on a playground, and I promise you, you are going to hear kids shouting one word, and you know what that word is, right? Mine, 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 mine. Mine is one of the first words that kids speak in every culture around the world. And this word only grows in importance as we get older. Now think for a moment about all the common sayings that we have about ownership, right? First come, first serve. Possession is 9/10 of the law. And many more of these as well. We learn these sayings about ownership at an early age. And thinking about ownership becomes so ingrained, we don't even realize it. It's like fish that are swimming in water, but don't realize what they don't even think it's wet. It's just there. And it's not just in common saying. So what I find particularly fascinating, think about the creation legends of Western civilization. So in Greek mythology, what is the catalyst for the birth of civilization? It's when Prometheus steals fire from the gods on Mount Olympus. Now, Prometheus pays a terrible price for taking what does not belong to him. You may recall his liver is torn out every day by an eagle, right? It's like a really sort of bad Gothic version of Groundhog Day. But the human ownership, the theft, and then the ownership of fire sparks civilization. Interestingly, the Garden of Eden story, right, in the Bible, that turns on ownership. Adam and Eve are punished for taking something that is not theirs. And it's not just the fruit from the tree of knowledge. They are quite literally evicted from the garden. Trespassing now exists as a result of theft. And God's not just changing the locks, right? Archangel Michael is placed in front with a flaming sword to guard to ensure they don't come back. They leave, human history begins, and mine has remained up for grabs ever since. So why does ownership feature so centrally in these creation myths? We argue at its core that human society exists to help us deal with competing claims to ownership. It may be food, water, partners, territory, so we don't kill each other too often. So let's return then to the first question. Why is reclining an airplane seat an ownership issue? Well, wherever people want the same thing, whenever there's not enough to go around, ownership is up for grabs. And realize that is everywhere and always. It's from the Garden of Eden to the wedge of reclining space behind a seat at 35,000 feet high, and every place in between. Michael, you want to take over?
Sure. Thanks so much, Jim. So let's go to our second question, which is why are seat recline battles breaking out now? Didn't used to happen. Planes didn't used to make emergency landings over these fights. No one thought to ask who controls the wedge of space, of the reclining space, because there used to be enough space for everyone. That's not true anymore. Tray table space has become a lot more valuable for our laptops. We all are getting larger. And airlines, importantly, have been shrinking the pitch. That's the distance between seats. It used to be about 35 inches not that long ago. It's down to about 28 inches on some planes today. Every inch of pitch saved per row adds up to 6 extra seats per flight for the airline to sell. So what airlines are doing is they're squeezing more of us into the same fixed tube. And as our personal space shrinks, that wedge becomes ever more valuable. Passengers are getting angrier at each other. Most of us assume that that wedge is up for grabs. It's available for either passenger to claim. So it's ambiguity about who controls the wedge that turns out to be the key to solving the puzzle for the first half of this talk. The ambiguity about who controls that wedge is no accident. Airlines actually do have a rule. You have a right to recline, but they never announce and they rarely enforce the rule. And why is that? It's because airlines are masters of ownership design. Those inches of space, that is their core product. They engineer those inches using one of the most advanced tools of ownership design, a tool that Jim and I call deliberate ambiguity. When ownership is ambiguous, and it's ambiguous a lot more often than you may think, when it's ambiguous, airlines know people will mostly fall back on politeness and good manners, not on law or rules. What we're trying to do is work it out between ourselves. And while we're doing that, airlines are profiting. What deliberate ambiguity does, and does intentionally, is it lets the airline sell that wedge of space twice on every seat, on every flight. Once for you to recline, and again for my knees and laptop. And even better, that is better for the airlines. All this conflict in economy class, that's what creates the market for higher price seats up front with enough legroom and no hassle. So the answer to our second question, why are these battles breaking out now, is because airlines are using an advanced tool of ownership design. They are profiting from the conflict that they have created. And it's for that reason, actually, that most airlines have banned knee defenders. They need to preserve ambiguity. Which brings us to our third question, which is who's the hero and who's the villain? To answer this question, we have to expand are a cast of characters a little bit beyond James Beach. Some of you may recall this image. This is from a video that went viral last year. This is Wendy Williams in front here in the red sweater. She's just reclined her seat into the guy behind. He's in the last row. He can't lean back. So he got mad and started banging her headrest without stopping, like an irritating metronome. Just went on and on and on. And she then posts this. So who's the jerk? Who's in the right? Is it the recliner in front or the guy in back? Is it Wendy or James? And actually here, I want to see what you all think. So Sandy, if you can put up a poll. This is a Santa Fe experiment here for us. Let's see if this works.
Okay, it's up, and I guess it was up from the beginning, and a lot of folks have already voted.
Okay. Has everybody voted? Can you show on the screen the results, please?
Let me see.
So close the poll.
And say share results.
Share results.
There we go. Interesting.
So 2/3 of you say, don't do it, it's wrong. And 1/3 of you say, go right ahead. So 2/3 of you say, don't do it. 1/3 of you basically support doing it. Ellen DeGeneres actually supports the 1/3. She says, unless the seat punches you, don't punch back. So reclining is A-okay. 2/3 of you actually go with Delta CEO, who's Ed Bastian. He was saying basically Wendy should have asked before leaning back. So this is sort of a Delta CEO crowd, not an Ellen DeGeneres crowd. Usually we give this poll a lot and to many, many, many different types of audiences. Usually the polls split about 50-50. Surprisingly, an international audience came out more in your guys' directions. Maybe you are more of an international crowd. And either way, however you voted, my guess is that most of you are not in doubt about your own view. But it's possible that you may be surprised a little bit at how much of the audience disagrees with you. So how's that possible? And the answer is that what's going on here is that what's mine, may seem obvious and natural to each of us. But this ownership conflict here over the wedge of space, like every ownership conflict in the world, over territory, everywhere, is really a storytelling battle. And remarkably, when things first come to be owned, things as trivial as a wedge of space and everything else, the battle always draws from, it turns out, just 6 simple stories. For those of you who voted with Wendy, the lean back story, you're asserting what we call attachment. The wedge of reclining space is attached to and thus belongs to the front seat. The button controls the wedge. This idea of attachment is one of the world's oldest legal principles. It dates back thousands of years. It's mine because it's attached to something mine. When you say, my home is my castle, you're invoking attachment. That's also why, for example, you own oil and water underneath your house or your country and airspace above. Attachment is the most important ownership principle you have never heard of. It's one of the most important tools as well for how we can slow climate change. For those of you who voted with James Beach and Need Defenders, it's a different story. Possession is 9/10 of the law. It's mine because I'm holding on to it. Possession is just as fundamental as attachment. It traces back to those territorial animal instincts we talked about before. Beach is saying, my knees, my laptop, they hold the space. It's mine. So when the seat reclines, it feels like a trespass. Attachment and possession are 2 of just 6 simple stories we all use to claim everything in the world, everything. The 3rd story is first in time, first come, first served. It's mine because I got it first. We use first in time all the time. This is how kids line up for ice cream cones at the store. This is how countries claim space for geosynchronous satellites in orbit. 4th story is labor. It's mine because I worked for it. This story goes back to the Bible. You reap what you sow. Reward for labor is the intuition behind all of intellectual property law. We grant patents to inventors. It's why we grant copyrights to artists. 5th story, self-ownership. It's mine because it comes from my body. Our bodies ourselves. This is the ownership story at stake when we fight over whether, for example, we should be able to sell our spare kidney. Or, for example, whether NCAA should be able to prevent college athletes from profiting from their celebrity. Sixth and final story is family. It's mine because I'm in the family, and that's a special group. We may say the meek shall inherit the earth, but the reality of family ownership today is far more troubling. We now live in an America with very generous rules for the super rich and a different, much harsher set for the rest of us. People sold or gave you most of what you own. That's not on the list. But where did they get it from? From someone who sold it to them and back and back and back. All ownership traces back to some original somebody who is, or some original country who is asserting one of these 6 stories. Conflicts arise when you assert one of the stories and I reply with another. Then what happens is we each claim the moral high ground. We each insist on the rightness, the naturalness of the story that advances our view. And here's the cool thing. The reclining seat battle is not just trivial issues like wedges of space on airplanes. It's playing out in places with far higher stakes. Let me give you one of those examples and then go back to Jim. So here's an example. More and more, all of us are living our lives on the web. Our internet activities reveal enormous amounts of personal information. It's what we buy, it's where we travel, even our health status. All this data is known as our clickstream. So if you ever wonder, for example, why after you search for an airline ticket to LA for the weekend, you get a bunch of ads for LA hotels and concerts. And the answer is that your travel website has tracked your activities online and sold that data to advertisers. Those clickstreams are likes and looks. They are worth hundreds of billions of dollars. They are what powers the internet economy. This is often framed as a privacy concern, but it really turns on ownership. So one of the central questions for our time is, should you be able to own your clickstream? Should you own it or the tech giants? Sandy, can you put up the second poll? Okay, so I want to give you maybe a few seconds to vote on this. Should Amazon and Facebook own your clickstream? Sure, that's the price I pay to use their services. Or no, that's my clickstream. My clickstream is mine. So let me give you maybe 5 more seconds. Who should own the clickstream? And then Sandy, can you share the results with us?
Hold on, votes still coming in. All right, I'll do it now.
So here you all are precisely consistent with what we see whenever and can you take the results off? Thank you. So 3/4 of you say basically I should own this. This battle is actually playing out right now. Whenever there's any new resource that emerges, like the wedge of space, when there's pitch shrinks or your clickstream online, ownership is ambiguous at first. And here, web companies, not airlines, they're staking their claim. They're claiming that clickstream for themselves. And here's the thing. The settings could not be more different between the wedge of space and your clickstream, but is the exact same ownership stories that are at play. Amazon and Facebook, they are telling an attachment story. They're saying our data trackers are like that button on the airplane seat, the clickstream data that attaches to the apps. We can respond with a different story. We can claim possession. We can say their trackers are trespassing into our lives. This is possession versus attachment all over again. So metaphorically, what's going on here is that Facebook and Amazon are leaning their data trackers into our virtual laps. And the question is, can we create virtual need defenders that keep the tech giants out? Now in Europe, and actually recently in California, they've started giving individuals, consumers, some control over data privacy. But not in New Mexico, not in the rest of America, and not anywhere else in the world. In most of the world, ownership of the clickstream remains ambiguous, remains up in the air. And the first step to claiming your clickstream is to realize that you, right now, are in the middle of a storytelling battle. And it's a storytelling battle for the fate of your online life. I want to close the circle here on seat reclining. What lessons can we take from this saga? Ownership conflicts are all around us. Whenever people want the same stuff, there's an ownership battle. And that is everywhere and always. Number 2, as resources become scarcer, the storytelling battle becomes more intense, and we have just 6 simple stories. This is true in every corner of the world. You may have noticed we're mostly using American examples so far today. It is certainly true that in different cultures, they will emphasize one story or another, but everyone, everywhere, always is choosing from the same simple storybook. Third lesson, finally, ownership is up for grabs. It is always a choice. There is never a necessary or correct or even legal answer for who gets what. We have to choose. So I want to pivot now, and we're going to basically, in the remainder of the talk, we're going to open a window into ownership, the hidden rules of ownership really work. And to do that, we're going to go quickly back to some of our sayings. My home is my castle. Possession is 9/10 of the law. First come, first serve. The reason these stories are so powerful is that all of them feel natural, fair, simple, right. But much of what you know about these stories turns out to be wrong. In practice, more and more often, the real ownership story is my home is not my castle. Possession is 1/10 of the law. First come is last serve. Savvy businesses, governments, they already know this. They are skilled at engineering the 6 simple stories of ownership to steer you to do what they want. So we're going to pivot now to the second half of the talk and do a little bit of a deep dive into just one of these 6 simple stories, My Home is My Castle and Attachment, and why this matters for foreign relations. And with that, I want to turn it back to Jim.
Great, thanks, Michael. So before we get into this, I think it's worth noting, particularly for this audience, that Michael and I actually both worked on international issues before we became law professors. So Michael worked at the World Bank, and he was basically working there after the fall of the Berlin Wall. He worked with post-communist countries to trying to basically restructure their economies to make them more like market economies. I worked after graduating from law school for the OECD in Paris. I worked on international environmental policy. So we're both very attuned and fascinated by international relations issues, and want to basically show how ownership, I think, gives some useful insights into thinking about these sort of issues. So My Home is My Castle is the story. The concept, the claim is attachment. It's mine because it's attached to something that's mine. And as Michael said at the outset, this essentially converts something that we know we own, like a 2-dimensional land title, into questions over 3-dimensional control over airspace. So let me give you a real example. So there's a guy, William Meredith, and he's in Kentucky, and he likes his home. And one afternoon, he found a drone was hovering over his house, going by. He thought it was too close, and so he took out his shotgun, as one does, and he shot it down with number 8 birdshot. A little later, guy comes to his front door and says, "Are you the son of a bitch who shot down my drone?" And Meredith apparently said something along the lines of, "You step onto my property, that's the last step you'll ever take." He's shocked to find that he's arrested, right? Who knew? And he basically becomes a bit of a local celebrity. He actually has a hashtag drone slayer that basically is his new handle. He's got some merch going. You can see the t-shirt here, hashtag drone slayer. He actually was found not guilty, if you're interested. But what's this got to do with ownership? Well, we know that we control the land, right? The surface around our property, but what about the airspace above? So it turns out about 100 years ago, airlines were sued by property owners for trespassing. The property owners basically said, the traditional vision of properties you own from your land down to hell, up to heaven. And if a plane flies through that air column, they're trespassing. Now, the courts at the time said, no, your attachment, your ownership claim stops at a certain level above. Let's now turn to drones, right? There are FAA rules that talk about how high drones can fly. They don't talk about how low drones can fly. And Amazon and UPS and Domino's Pizza, they see a world where drones are doing deliveries. And so this is a very real question, right? Are they trespassing when they go over your backyard or not? Where else do we see attachment as a basic principle? Well, groundwater. All right, so it turns out that when you draw water from an aquifer, you create what's called a cone of depression. This is different from the cone your dog has to wear, which is a cone of shame after some kind of operation. So it can't eat or nibble away at the wound. What happens to the cone of depression is you basically draw the water down in the aquifer. The problem with that is if you have neighbors, because essentially what you can do is to dry up their wells. This actually can happen quite a bit. And so attachment basically tells you, do I own the water underneath my property? Well, you think so, but what happens if someone, because of their own drilling, starts taking your water and sucking it into their basically cone of depression? Right? It turns out we have, I'm not going to go into details, we have 5 different rules. Depending on which state you're in, it's a different rule. In Texas and Maine, which are the most extreme, it's the rule of capture, right? And if your neighbor pumps your well dry, that's too bad, right? It's attached to their property. If they take what's attached, it's theirs. Similar thing early in the late 1800s, early 1900s, with wildcatting, with oil rigs, right? All these oil rigs were on top of each other. They were all pumping out. They were saying attachment. I own the rig above. I own the oil underneath. Well, it turns out that there was some ownership engineering. They came up with a doctrine called unitization, where instead of each person for themselves, they had to work as a unit in trying to keep the oil pressure within the field. So these are sort of domestic examples. Let's talk about the principle of attachment once we go overseas. Now, I'm going to ask, we don't have a chat function that's operating, but I ask if anyone knows what this is, this table tent. It turns out it's the Russian flag. This is a titanium flag that was placed on the bottom of the Arctic by a Russian sub about 10 years ago. And the sub commander became a national hero when he came back. They had these press conferences with it's a happy polar bear here, I promise you. It's not a happy polar bear in the Arctic right now, and the stories are related. Why is Russia doing this, right? It seems like a strange publicity stunt. They're doing it because the polar ice caps are melting. The fabled northwestern route is already open much of the year. Scientists predict that the Arctic could be completely ice-free in summers by 2050. And it's opening up enormous opportunities for extraction. And so basically all these countries are racing to try to make a land grab. It's the first major land grab since the colonial period in the 17 and 1800s. Now, no one thinks Russia is going to actually legally get territory under the North Pole because they put a little titanium table tent, but it's a warning shot and a high stakes ownership conflict, right? It's all mine, it's my land. Who owns this? Who owns this? Well, this comes down directly to the principle of attachment and the law of the sea. Right, the law of the sea, UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, says that coastal states control up to 200 nautical miles off their coast. It's something called the exclusive economic zone. And this funky looking map basically shows that. That's a given. UNCLOS also says you can extend your EEZ along your continental shelf, as long as your continental shelf extends further outward. And so there's all kinds of research going on right now where essentially countries are trying to make their claim that their EEZ should be extended farther and farther north into the Arctic Circle. Ownership on the other side of the world, seventh great continent. Who owns Antarctica? Well, turns out maybe everyone, maybe no one. So these are all the different claims that have been put forward prior to 1950s about territorial claims. Some of these essentially are first possession, labor, so that would be Britain, France for their polar expeditions. You've got attachment, which would be something like New Zealand or Argentina. Australia, we're close, and therefore it's close to us. Therefore, like the wedge of space behind the reclining seat. Argentina also is the papal bull on its favor, as does Chile when the Pope divided the New World between Spain and Portugal. So there were these completing claims out there. Realize, of course, who's missing from this list, which after World War II are the 2 global superpowers, the US and the USSR. Now, interestingly, back in 1924, the USA had rejected all of these ownership claims. They said, you've got to discover, and then you've got to settle. And so what we have is this very strange mishmash, where you've got all these claims over who owns Antarctica. And so what's ownership engineering? How is that dealt with? Well, ownership engineering through the Antarctic Treaty basically says we're going to freeze these claims in place. We're going to agree to disagree. The Antarctic Treaty essentially says we are not going to make a judgment over the validity of these claims. For the moment, Antarctica basically is open access, but no extraction activities, right? No resource, no military activities. So at least for right now with this treaty, my home is not my castle, right? It actually negates the attachment principle. Now let's turn to another aspect of international affairs and what many think is perhaps the most fraught global hotspot in the world. And this too turns on ownership claims. This is the South China Sea. It's got these sort of atolls, these rocks that come up at high tide, Spratly Islands, Mischief Reef, other pirate names, right? No one cared about these until fairly recently. Uh, why are they important? They're important because the South China Sea is the most valuable shipping strait in the world. And if you control these islands, you control the 200-mile EEZ radius around the islands. That's a lot of territory. Um, very different claims for what's going on, right? Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, somewhat historical claims, largely based on attachment. It's nearby. So what's China got to do with this? Well, China claims sovereignty from a 1947 map that they used to divide up essentially the Sino world between Taiwan and the mainland. They call it the 9-dash map. But what's really going on is claims by possession. So in recent years, China has been building concrete military bases essentially on top of these atolls, many of them with airstrips. Why is that? UNCLOS says that an EEZ attaches to territory that is habitable above mean high tide. So China is combining its actual possession with the attachment principle. The possession is realpolitik. We are a superpower now, try to push us off, and attachment, right? We get the EEZ that goes along with that. The US military is actively challenging this claim, right? They actually, one of their operations is called the Operation Freedom of Navigation, which is not your typical name for a military exercise. So that's happening there. But now let's talk about, I'm an environmental guy. Let's sort of finish up by talking about natural resources. So you may be familiar with this reality TV show, The Deadliest Catch. And this basically is Alaska crab, king crab fishing boats going out into the Bering Sea. And it in fact was the deadliest catch when the show started. It was more dangerous to be a crew member on these boats than to be on foot patrol in Iraq. Why was that? Well, the rule essentially was first come, first serve. They basically had a season with a certain quota, and day one of the season starts, and all the boats go out there, whether it's good weather or bad weather. Because if you stay in port and other folks catch their crabs, when the quota is reached, the season ends. And so there was, it's called derby fishing. It was very dangerous because they would go out in no matter what condition. How was this dealt with? Well, it was dealt with through ownership engineering. And now today it's actually the not deadly catch at all, which is not as nice a TV title. But essentially what happened was in Iceland, they came up with ownership engineering. They said, how about if we turn the season's catch into something that can be owned, and we allocate your share of the season's catch up front. We attach it to the vessel. Then the vessel basically has the whole season to decide when it's going to go out and actually get its allocation. If the weather's bad, they stay in port. If the prices are low, they stay in port. And as a result of this, this sort of as if ownership, we call it, as if you could own the catch, the profits have gone up, and no one dies in this fishery anymore. It's been a huge success story, and it's been copied all over the world. Well, can this apply to other global challenges? And the answer is absolutely. The basic challenge in all of these situations with land use is that the landowner does not own, does not control the benefits that he or she provides. So, for example, forests, right? With climate change, forests provide the great benefit of carbon sequestration. They suck up the carbon dioxide from the air. They breathe out oxygen. That's all good. When forests are cut down, you not only lose that carbon sequestration capacity, but the carbon's released because oftentimes it's burned. And the question is, how can you battle that? And the answer is a policy that's become known as REDD, reduced emissions from deforestation and land degradation. And what REDD does is it basically treats the landowners, whether it's a state or local, as if they own the carbon sequestration that their forests are producing. And essentially they are paid to reduce the level of deforestation. It's as if they own this benefit that we all get. And the key question, this is what I find I do a lot of work in this area. The question is, how do you make trees worth more standing than cut down? And the only way to do that, because regulations just don't work very well in many parts of the world, is to change the incentives. And you change the incentives by looking at how things can be controlled. So we showed you the slide earlier in the talk. And you see it and you say, well, one kid is shouting mine, the other kid's shouting mine, what's going on? Now you can pick this apart, because what's really going on is one of them is saying, mine, I'm holding on to it. The other is saying, no, mine, I had it first. This is not just a screening match. It is a storytelling battle between possession and first in time. Just two of the 6 simple stories everyone uses to claim everything. And you also know, I think quite remarkably, that businesses and governments are using the exact same stories to decide who can recline, who owns your clickstream, who controls the oceans and its resources, and hundreds of other ownership conflicts that are all around us all the time. Ownership is a form of social engineering, right? We focus in the second half of the talk in terms of attachment, right? Basically, my home really is not my castle. But there's a larger issue going on here, and that is that savvy owners have learned how to turn all these ownership stories upside down. And by savvy owners, we mean both governments and businesses. And so, as Michael's going to show with some of the last examples we have, there are a lot of questions out here, sort of parting puzzles that all deal with ownership. We don't think about them as ownership, but once you start to see them as ownership, you can see not only the problem, but also the solution. So Michael, if you can take us home.
Thank you so much, Jim. So these are all examples that we can come back to in Q&A if there's specific interest. But once you know where to look, these hidden rules of ownership actually explain so many puzzles. They are all around us in our everyday lives as citizens and as consumers, but also in these bigger venues as an international arena as citizens. So I want to just leave you with a musing about a few of these puzzles, which is, and here's the first one. Why is it that HBO actually encourages, doesn't just tolerate, it encourages people to illegally share their passwords? All our students illegally share their passwords, and they're law students. Like, what's in it for HBO? Why are they letting people get away with this? So I'm gonna just leave it as a question. Maybe we can, and the answer turns out to be an ownership story. Why can we sell our blood plasma, but not our spare kidney? Like, what is it that we own and don't own, or own and can't sell of our bodies? How do we decide that? How is it and why is it that Amazon's buy now button makes you overpay? The buy now button on Amazon, the little shopping cart and the buy now button, they don't mean what you think they mean. And you actually pay Amazon an unearned premium on every download of a book or a movie. And that's also a piece of ownership design that they've mastered. And finally, and this may be of interest to you as an international crowd, how is it that South Dakota has become the world's leading money haven? Actually, today it turns out that South Dakota has absolutely crushed Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. This is where rich people go to stash their money in South Dakota. And what does that mean for America and actually for the world to have South Dakota as its own sort of policy, maintaining a new aristocracy of inherited wealth? Anyway, these 4 puzzles, 100 more all around us, may seem completely unrelated. They all snap into focus as soon as you look at them through the lens of ownership. And that's where we want to pause for now, actually, and then turn it over to questions. We want to leave you with a challenge, which is this. If you pick up any newspaper, if you pick up today's newspaper or tomorrow's or next week's, whenever you're listening to this talk, Jim and I are 100% confident that there will be a front page story that will turn on on ownership. And how, you may ask, how can we be so sure? And the answer is that those 6 simple stories we discussed today, they frame every struggle over the things all of us want. And that is a lot of things. Once you see how ownership works, you really can't unsee it. And once you do see it, it becomes possible to be a more effective advocate for change as a parent, as a consumer, and as a citizen. If it's okay, before I turn it back to Sandy, just give me maybe 1 minute for a little bit of self-promotion before the Q&A. Jim and I are really passionate about the ideas in mind. I think they really can make a difference in your lives. We have a website for the book, mindthebook.com, which has a ton of free resources that we've put up there that we want you to make use of. We actually have downloadable excerpts from the book. We have a free ebook. We have about a dozen 2-minute videos that touch on topics we couldn't get to today. We have links to all of our social media channels. We'd love for you to check it out. If you have other audiences that we should be talking to, Jim and I love to talk about this stuff. Where in the age of Zoom, we can go anywhere. And we also, last thing I guess, then it's to Sandy, which is we wrote this book for readers of books like Freakonomics and Tipping Point and Nudge. It's meant to change how you see the world. It's an easy read. It's a great gift. So we at least hope that some of you will consider making mine yours. So with that, thank you so much for being with us today. And we can't wait for your questions. I'm going to stop sharing, turn it back to Sandy.
Well, thank you so much. And let me say, I just finished the book last night. It's absolutely riveting. I don't know how you managed to turn so much legal perspective into an engaging read, but my kudos. And I couldn't help but think as I was reading it, and you're pulling out all these different examples to illustrate those 6 major types of ownership. Were you guys constantly just reading the news or listening, to your students in your classroom saying, aha, there's another example that we need to incorporate into the book?
So it was a combination. Part of it, Michael and I both teach property law, and we both, we're popular teachers. We enjoy being in the classroom. So part of this was taken from stories we've used in the classroom over the years that work. But a lot of it was, as you said, Michael and I would sort of shoot these stories back and forth. And as Michael has put it, he actually said this later, not at the time, but I think he's right. Basically, the story had to be original, it had to be interesting, and it had to be infuriating. And again, as Michael said, ownership stories are all around us all the time, and so there's no lack of them. The issue, as you said, was kind of culling to see what would appeal to people. The thing that's fascinating is the need defender just really riles people up.
Well, I see we have some questions about that as well from Barbara. So I don't know how you want to order this.
Yeah, well, sure. Why don't we do that? Why don't we go to Barbara Chatterjee's question around, well, how in the world do we get airlines to give the space back? Or are airlines going to actually demarcate what is your space and what is not your space?
Michael?
Yeah. Oh.
Well, the joys of co-ownership. So let me start off, then Michael will jump in. Airlines will keep the status quo as long as it benefits them. And if more fights break out, then eventually they will have to tweak the contours of ownership. Right now, it's brilliant because they're not regarded as the actual owners. But there was a study that was done that basically showed that if you really want to get people not to recline into your navel, asking them not to, it's not terribly effective. Paying them, surprising, is actually not that effective. The single most effective way to prevent them from leaning back is to offer to buy them a drink or some food. And it's sort of this act of generosity and community that sort of brings you together. Now, another way to deal with this, obviously, and you're seeing this more and more, are seats that, quote, preclined, where they're locked in place, or there's a plastic shell, so the actual bag doesn't move as you shift. But I got to tell you, when I flew before COVID, I flew Frontier Airlines, and I just, my knees were up in my chin. I felt like, the pitch has shrunk from about 35 inches years ago to like 28 on some of the airlines today. I'm 6'1", and it is a trial.
Jim and I have wondered over as we've been giving these polls, like, what is it? We didn't have sophisticated enough data to figure out like what drives the split. I think, and we should probably test this out. I think there may also be a gender component to this. There's also a tallness component, and height and gender are related. Anyway, so there may be a gender component. As Jim said, 3/4 of the time, the person in front of you will not lean back if you buy them a snack or a drink. That's the most powerful individual solution onto this ownership dispute. The most powerful citizen solution is that 3 years ago in 2018, the FAA decided finally that they were not going to regulate seat pitch, that they were going to leave this as a competitive choice among the airlines. If it's inconvenient enough and painful enough, the theory is you'll switch airlines. But there's a lot of collusion among the airlines and shrinking the pitch. And it's possible that when the FAA revisits this today, and it could revisit it based on consumer pressure, that the position could go the other way. And the bigger point there is that the wedge of space, just like every other ownership dispute, geosynchronous satellites, Arctic and Antarctic, all of those are choices that are up for grabs. There isn't a fixed or correct or final answer. So if it gets irritating enough, if there start to be enough fistfights up in the air, then the ownership rule can and will change. The stories that we will choose from won't change. Those 6 stories remain the same, but the way that we divide them or balance them can change, either through individual action or, in this area, more likely through regulation.
Yeah, and I like how in the book you explain how we essentially buy with our ticket price, a 2-dimensional seat, the fake leather, spot for our bottom, but then there's all kinds of ambiguity around the 3D space in front of us and behind us. Super interesting. Another story that
here's my armrest divider for your viewers. You stick this on the armrest, and it divides it between you and the person next to you. This is actually still legal.
Huh. So another story that's sort of in the same category of this that you describe in the book happens in Sunnyvale, California, where a woman has planted redwood trees, and then 5 years later, a neighbor moves in next door, wants to install solar panels, but they're being blocked by the redwood trees, and therefore, who owns the sun's light becomes a really interesting philosophical question. Can you tell us a little bit more about that particular story?
Yeah, so this is competing stories of attachment, right? So basically, should I be able to grow trees as high as I want them to let them grow because they are attached to my land, and trees are wonderful, right? Or is the sunlight that goes onto my solar panels, is that attached to my property, and therefore anything that blocks the sunlight going on is basically taking something that's mine. And the fascinating thing about this is that both parties in this are about as green as you could want, right? There's no villain in this story. And so, a simplistic way to look at this, which is the way the state of California looked at it, was that, well, one side's got to win, one side's got to lose. Either we favor tree owners or we favor solar energy. And it turned out that they actually passed a law that favored solar energy. And the people who bought the trees said that were the first people in history to be prosecuted for growing redwoods, and they had to lop off the trees. What Michael and I talk about in the book is another way to think about this, which is basically to say both parties are in the right. There's not a bad actor here. And so, look, if you want to favor solar energy, that's fine. Give the solar panel owner the ability to say, you've got to lop off your trees, but you've got to pay the folks the fact that they're losing some of their trees. So if you want solar, that's fine, but you got to pay something for it because you're harming the other person. Or similarly, if you want to grow your trees, that's fine, but you've got to pay the solar person for the power that they're losing. It basically is a way to think of ownership not as an on-off switch, which is our natural kind of crude way of thinking about it, but instead, as we argue in the book, as a dimmer switch. Michael, you want to add anything?
No, that's great.
So, question here from George Duncan, which touches on, at least a chapter in the book that we haven't talked about so far, but it's really on our medical data, whether we own it or not. You talk a lot about, 23andMe and these, DNA swabs we can take to see what our ancestry is like. I know this is a big issue, but can you talk about some of those ownership issues related to our bodies ultimately?
So yeah, George, thank you for that. This is really it's a very personal question for a lot of us, which is, it feels like quite an intrusion into our most intimate sphere to know that our insurance companies, our doctors, our online searchers are collecting really a more detailed picture of our own lives, often than we're even aware of. That is, often with AI now, the clickstream can actually divulge medical problems that we don't even know that we have based on the terms that we search for. So one very sort of concrete example of this today, it has to do with something that Sandy just mentioned, which is 23andMe. So a lot of us go and we swab our cheek and send in a vial to 23andMe or Ancestry.com to get a sense of, what's our heritage, where do we come from? And we don't stop and think, like, why is that so cheap? Well, that's actually a pretty sophisticated science to decode our DNA. And yet 23andMe will do it for you for $99 or even less. And the question is, why? And the answer, it turns out, is an ownership story, which is that your DNA is actually worth a lot more than that. And it costs them more than that to decode it. You're not actually the consumer in that transaction. What they're doing, what 23andMe is doing, Ancestry.com is doing, is they need you to swab the cheek to basically collect data for their database. What their real product is the database of your private DNA information and everyone else's, which they then sell to insurance companies to help set rates, and to pharmaceutical companies as a very cheap way to do high-powered diagnostic target testing for new drug molecules that they may develop into clinical trials. So the reason that is that your DNA is cheap is that you're actually the product that they're selling to other industries. And it's very much similar to clickstreams. And it's true for medical data that you're asking specifically about, which is that where ownership, where there is any new resource, when they squish seats together, that wedge of space is a new resource, becomes valuable. When online data becomes available as a resource, when your medical data becomes available, anytime a new resource becomes available, there's initially ambiguity about ownership. And then what you have is basically a rush to claim that resource. It's like the gold miners in California in 1848. It's like the space for geosynchronous satellites today. It's like the Russian flag underneath the water. And it's the same for your medical data. So the 23andMe is using the labor story. They're saying, we've done the work of assembling your data and everyone else's into this database, and therefore it's ours. And I guess the hope that we have once you read mine is that you can see, well, that's labor story isn't the correct or natural or only or fair story. It's just one story. And there's another story that you can assert back as a citizen saying, no, I should have rights. I should be the one that controls my own most personal, most intimate medical and genetic data based on self-ownership, or based on first in time, or based on possession. That we have a series of stories available to us to fight back against the attachment and the labor story around our medical data.
So let's go to the American West for a little bit, and I'll build on a question here from Barbara Chatterjee. You know, you state in your book that it's no exaggeration to say that the shape of the American West today arises directly from choices the country made well over a century ago regarding whose labor and what labor accounted for ownership of land, minerals, and water. Can you expand on that a little bit and help us see our state in a different way from an ownership perspective?
Yeah, sure. And it's a fascinating issue, and it really explains why the U.S. looks the way it does. And let me give you two quick examples. One of them is, we have this doctrine of first come, first served. So when the Europeans came to the New World, why didn't the Native Americans own that land in the eyes of the courts instead of the Europeans? And essentially, in a very famous case that all law students study called Johnson v. McIntosh, what the Supreme Court said was, you don't own it because you're not using it the right way. Your labor is not productive. Basically, what the court said was ownership is established by productive use of the land. We're basically building stone walls, planting row agriculture, putting up buildings, right? Making New England look like Old England. And that really explains the ownership of why the Native Americans were dispossessed on the East Coast. Let's go to the West Coast. Louisiana Purchase opens up enormous areas of land out west. And the federal government has two big concerns. Right? The first big concern is that the European powers are going to change their mind and try to take it back. America, after all, is still a pretty young country. The second is the Native Americans are out there and they're going to fight to defend what they regard as theirs. So what does the government do? It passes a series of laws. The Homestead Act, the Mining Law of 1872, other laws like that for timber as well. And all these laws share the same feature, the railroads also. And what they say is, if you go out there and you make productive use of public lands in a certain way, it's yours. Homestead Act, 160 acres. If after 5 years you improve the land, it's yours. Mining Act of 1872, which is still in force. Right? If you stake a claim, if you mine valuable minerals, either you own the rights to that place or you can actually patent it and own it in title. Water. If you divert water and put it to productive and beneficial use, you own the water right. All of those are doing the exact same thing, which is basically saying we're going to create a big fat incentive for you to move out here and settle this in exchange for ownership. And so it's no surprise that these laws shape the West. And what's challenging is that the laws that we have that are still governing many of these resources are laws that were developed in the 1800s for that purpose. And 21st century America is very different. Yet we're using, 49ers, right? We're using basically the water law from mining camps from 1849, 1850s. Law can become very sticky, particularly when it involves ownership rights. And that's what we're struggling with right now. I mean, there's tons more I could say about it, but that's kind of the core of it.
Very interesting. I also want to kind of stay with the West in the sense of the Wild West. And you write about, for example, the fashion industry and how, a couture house can spend all kinds of time, money, and energy on a fashion line. And then the next week, big retailers can knock off that and sell it as, their own clothing. Why does the fashion industry take that approach? Is this similar to the question Michael was asking earlier about HBO not caring about sharing of passwords? And why would that be a good strategy?
Well, it's actually different, a little bit. Yes, it's the same universe, a little bit different story. HBO actually has ownership rights over its content. It just chooses to tolerate and promote theft as a business strategy to basically acquire customers, same way as Disney uses it to source product development. For the fashion industry, they would like to have ownership, but they have never been able to basically buy enough senators and congresspeople to acquire it. The music industry and HBO went to Congress and basically bought the rights that they wanted. Couture houses try that every year, and they haven't. Oddly, because they can put on fancy fashion shows and invite people to openings and gala stuff. This is usually what senators and congresspeople kind of like, and then they vote that way. But for some reason, it hasn't worked in this case. But it turns out that the fashion industry is enormously creative, and it's creative without property rights. So we've talked today about how ownership is, in some senses, underrated. Like ownership is underrated in terms of environmental solutions. If you're going to solve a lot of these big environmental solution problems, you need to really think very carefully about how you engineer ownership. If you're going to solve disputes over territory, this is Linda's question in the queue, you have to think very carefully about international law as well. So in some sense, law is underrated. That's one of our messages. But in many senses, law is overrated. And that's the other sort of big theme that we have. And for the fashion industry, it's such a good example because there you have creativity without law. What you have is reputation, what you have is moving first. You have all sorts of substitutes outside of patent and copyright. And it turns out that the fashion industry didn't die when they didn't get the protection that they asked for, and just the opposite, they actually thrive. The reason we have protection for patents and copyrights is not to reward the labor of the inventor or the artist, not at all. That's never been in America the reason for that form of property. The reason we have property rights in that area at all is only to spur invention and creativity, period. So if you can get creativity, for example, in fashion, without property rights, that's better. Because once you have the creativity, other people can copy it. We can get more economic activity. So in America, historically, IP law, intellectual property law, has been founded on productivity, creativity, not on reward to labor. So fashion designers say, I deserve to get protected because I created this. But that's not really the theory of American. And in fact, HBO, for example, was able to buy, or the music industry was able to buy its protection based on that kind of a claim. But it's not really what drives or should drive IP law, intellectual property law in this country. My position over the decades now, writing on this, is that we have way too much property law, way too much ownership law in the intellectual property area, that we would be a wealthier society and a fairer society with less. A recent study by some BU economists suggests that if we actually the American economy would grow, that is the patents without a patent system, that if we eliminated the patent system for all areas except pharmaceuticals, except drugs, so you leave patents for drugs, but the rest of the patent system is actually value subtracting. The rest of the patent system is like taking a big pile of money and burning it. It actually reduces welfare in the economy, that we're better off in a world with fewer patents. And we're also very much better off in a world with fewer copyrights. And the fashion industry is the poster child for us. It's the best example of the value of non-ownership. You get creativity without law.
Let me ask you two more questions, and this is so interesting. The first of two is from Barbara, and she asks, can you comment on the decoupling of end purchasers or end users from being considered the ultimate consumer with rights at the decision table? Healthcare is perhaps the most serious example of this, where the patient has almost no place at the table, where what services are offered are determined.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question in terms of market dynamics. And I'm actually, it's a good question, Barbara, and I'm answering this off the top of my head. We haven't gotten this question in the past. My immediate reaction is that the owners, in the sense, are insurance companies, right? I mean, they're the actual customers in the sense that they're the ones who are paying rather than patients in most cases. And so, I mean, I think what this question gets at more broadly is the issue of how do ownership regimes change, right? And they can change either because the end customers basically say, we want to own this product or the service in a different way. And so the seller basically changes how these things are offered. Or they get the government to come in and to redefine the ownership rights. I'd have to think about whether healthcare delivery, whether using an ownership prism for healthcare delivery actually helps us or not. I don't know, Michael, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, what the question sort of gets to is sort of on the side of our topic, which is something that economists talk about as principal agent problems. So we are ultimately responsible for our own health. We are the principal, we're in some sense the sort of the ultimate consumer of those services. But we appoint agents for us who are not faithful necessarily to our interests. Their loyalties are divided. So it's an ownership story in that sense, which is that, and we see this true. This is the essence of the modern American corporation, right? A corporation, and sometimes we may be the shareholders, we may be the principals, but our agents, the CEO, the managers, are often not faithful to our interests. The reason that they get paid 300 times the base worker's salary rather than 60 or 100 what it used to be, that they're able personally to extract a lot more of the rents, of the surplus, or the profits from that company, really by virtue of being in control. That's a so-called principal agent problem. It's really much at the core of a lot of American corporate governance theory. And it's also the same problem in healthcare, which is how do we, as consumers, have faithful agents, have insurance companies that will make decisions that are cost justified for our care. And it's very hard to, with that separation of principal from agent, very hard to force them to make those decisions in a cost justified way, in a way that sort of takes care of us as a social, as a community as a whole. What we often have is a divergence between the private wealth maximizing choice of the health insurance company versus the social welfare maximizing. How are we as a society better off decision about what sort of procedures to cover or not? It's part of why many countries that are much poorer than the US have so much better health outcomes, because those decisions are being made for social welfare, for the good of society as a whole, but with limited resources, rather than for the private wealth maximizing concern of that insurance company. It's a very deep and very big question.
Well, in the spirit of a deep and big question, let me ask you the final one, which is a fairly philosophical / legal one, and it's a theme that runs throughout your book. You write that ownership design is only as good as the designers, and that designing ownership comes, quote, to define who we are as consumers and citizens in our interactions with each other over the essential goods of modern life. So what is the future? What does the present look like around retooling, reimagining, or firming up ownership design?
I can jump off, then Michael can bring it home. So one of the things that I've found so fascinating about this project is that ownership is at once immediately current and timeless. It's timeless in the sense that anytime you have organisms that are basically seeking the same scarce resource, you got to have some kind of rules. Maybe might makes right if it's in a petri dish or whatever, or on the savannah, but you need some kind of rules to allocate scarce resources. That's an argument for why we have society. And that's been as true for, since we came down from the trees. And we think, frankly, the 6 stories that we talk about have been in play ever since then, fundamentally as well, perhaps with different terms. And so the timeless part of ownership is that ownership is always being reimagined and reshaped, because new resources come on into our spheres that are scarce and valued, right? We didn't used to care about the airwaves, now we do. You know, when there's a bunch of space between seats and we didn't use laptops, no one cared about the reclining wedge, now we do, right? And this happens all the time. It always has happened, it always will. And so, you know, it's basically, it is, I think, frankly, part of the human condition to have to come up with these rules of ownership. So that's the timeless. The current part is that we face very specific challenges today. Who owns your clickstream, right? Is the one we talk about. Who gets the front of the line for COVID is something we were just dealing with recently. Those are all ownership questions, and they're topical, and they have to be decided right now. And the key point here is that there is no right answer. There are always conflicting stories, which means there are always conflicting values. And the question then becomes, as we said, it depends on who the decision maker is, whose hands is on the remote control, who's going to decide which story wins. Michael, anything you want to say in closing this?
I just wanted to just not leave Jean and Elizabeth hanging. So, and then I'm going to wrap it up. So Jean, it's the same fight over the space under your seat as the space above and beyond. It's attachment all around. That's number one. Elizabeth, pharmaceuticals are different because it costs $1 billion to put a pill in a bottle, and if you don't give some rights to that, people won't invest the billion. So pharmaceuticals have a different structure from other things that people invent. So the last point in terms about the future of ownership, people sometimes say we're seeing the end of ownership, that we're moving to just a world of where you sort of stream car services, and you click a button and your dinner comes, and you click a button and you have a house for the night, Airbnb. And that's something fundamentally different, that we're moving to a really different world of ownership. I don't think that's actually right. I think that we're not moving to the end of ownership. What we're moving to is the hyper concentration of ownership in a very small number of very large companies, where if you don't pay your phone bill on your iPhone, they brick your phone, literally. You won't be able to get your photos, you won't be able to get your contacts. Your whole life becomes contingent on making those regular payments. In a way that's different from, and you lose the book. They can take the book off of your Kindle. In a way that's different with hard, tangible, physical stuff. So it's the same stories, but in moving to the online world, we're facing some new, really very deep choices about how we structure ownership. And I'm wary somewhat about moving to a world just of online ownership. I think I like to cook. I have old cookbooks where those, the stains on the pages from 25 years ago remind me of a dinner party. It's very meaningful to me. And I don't know that I want to live in a world where I rent my wedding ring or lease my dog. I think there's a real spiritual dimension to ownership, which we're at risk of losing touch with as we move to our online lives. But my hope, and Jim and my hope in writing this book, is that what you see as listeners, and I hope as readers, is that it really is just a handful of very simple stories that are at play, back in the Bible, and that are at play in our online lives. And people are often telling you stories about ownership that seem uncontestable. They seem natural and right and fair. And what we hope is that by listening to us and by reading the book and thinking about it, you have some tools, you have some ammunition to be able to fight back and say, well, no, that's not right. That isn't the only possible solution to the wedge of space or Antarctica or who owns the moon or any of the hundreds of ownership disputes that are around us every day. And you individually feel empowered to make a difference as a consumer, but also as a citizen.
Well, Michael Heller, Jim Salzman, thank you so much. That was fascinating. The book, of course, is mine, How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives. I highly recommend it. I found it an absolutely riveting read. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your wonderful insights.
Great. Thank
so
you so much.
All right. Well, thanks once again, everybody, for joining us here. We will see you all, I hope, on Saturday, starting at 9:30 for our second annual Global Citizen Summit. And until then, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.